Many books have been written about Vancouver, but how many can claim to have captured the soul of the city? A local author and journalist may well have done just that. Very Vancouver is a new collection of stories that look at the city through the eyes of ordinary, everyday places and people, crossing borders of race and class. I'm John Ackermann, and this is the Bookshelf Podcast. And here to talk about Very Vancouver, uncovering the soul of a city, is Christopher Cheung. Welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Christopher, first of all, congratulations on the book. It really is a treasury of the people and the places that make Vancouver special. Um, is that what you set out to do here? Was that the goal?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I'm glad you enjoyed it. As a reporter who's worked for a little over a decade, I think we all have those stories that we collect, and then we see that they have a really long kind of tail. It's not just in the moment, but they seem to have this popularity that people go to and go to again. So I always knew I wanted to put this book together. So as you mentioned, it is 15 stories. They're 15 real stories. There's about 70 people interviewed. And I've always really loved books about myths growing up. And I just thought it'd be fun to do a book about kind of these origin stories or myths about Vancouver phenomena. So everybody sees Vancouver specials, but where did Vancouver specials come from? Where did those lions that are in front of all these houses and sometimes the acorns and pineapples, where did those come from? If you're seeing veggies in people's backyards, stuff like bitter melon, like who are the people who grow those? So there's a lot of those types of origin stories. And then also some, I guess, what I would call like larger than life characters. So the baklava man, like who's this guy who sells baklava on the side of the streets? Turns out he has a political past in Syria. And also binners. Like I think all of us who, we've gone out to a Vancouver park in the summer, or if you happen to have an alley, you do hear that clinking when somebody comes along, usually somebody who is older, and asks for your cans and bottles. Like what is their life? Are they collecting this for income? Do they have other work? What's going on over there? So I do hope with all of these stories that together it paints a different portrait of the city. And if you look at the cover, we were very intentional about that. There's no, it has all the stuff that I've just described now, but there's no skylines there. There's no nice beaches. So I hope that signals to people that this is a different kind of a book that wants to get down to the sidewalk level in a different way. So you could meet these people face to face through these stories.
Now, Chris, in your previous book, Under the White Gaze, Solving the Problem of Race and Representation in Canadian Journalism, you argue that multiculturalism stops where most newsrooms begin, and that people of color are often presented as cliches rather than people with complex stories. To me, Very Vancouver is an outgrowth of that. The people you talk to all have very much complex stories to tell.
Yeah, so that book is, I did try to write that book for a general audience, but I think whenever people hear, words like, critical race theory, or like we're going to talk about, white supremacy or the white gaze, some people might be like, what? Like, are you, like, what are we talking about over here? And I think when it comes to newsrooms, that just really comes down to this question that shows up at the pitch meeting. Like, who gets to tell their stories? Who gets to decide which story is important? If we're going to assign this story, who are we going to be interviewing? Is this a story that a person from a particular group, whether it's race or sexual orientation or whatever, is this a story that that person from the inside would care about? Or is this really just for an outsider looking in? And I think for stories about, when they do touch on immigration experiences or people of color or even neighborhoods that I think get stigmatized in Vancouver, particularly in the East Side, it is from that outsider's mindset, or it portrays the story in kind of a cute way. So as I've mentioned, the Binner story, like I'm not the first person to write about people who collect cans and bottles for a living, but I have seen stories where these people are portrayed in that cutesy, folksy way. So it's like, oh wow, isn't that great that they're going out recycling? I can't communicate with them, but they say a couple words in English and then they speak something in Cantonese or Vietnamese that I don't understand. But it's not really from that person's perspective. Like, where do they go home to at night? And there's and I think there's a lot of serious things that get downplayed as well. Like, this is an older person who's working, they don't have PPE. If I see them diving into a dumpster, I've read stories where like, wow, like, isn't it incredible that she's going in there at like 80 years old without any protective equipment? But in my mind, I'm like, like, how come this person is doing this? This is a hazard. If this person was doing a formal job, they would be given some kind of equipment. So I really wanted to flip it on its head in that way, that, if you read some of these stories, it starts right with each character, and so I would hope that you're walking along with them. Like in the Binner story, I tag along with the spinner who lives in an SRO in Chinatown, and I walk with her to the bottle depot. So it's great you get that story as if she was living it whenever she goes to do her recycling.
I think the challenge for all of us as an industry is to not present these people merely as curiosities, but as real three-dimensional personalities with lives and struggles and backstories as well.
Yeah, and I do understand that's hard, especially with the 24/7 timeline of news, right? Like I've heard, I won't mention the outlet, but I heard once from an intern who interned at one of these newer digital outlets, and he said he had to do 20, 30 a day, 20, 30 stories a day. And so I think when you're on that timeline, it's nearly impossible to cover this kind of story that somebody 20 or 30 years ago might have been able to, but also who you happen to hire in the newsroom. If you have people from different class backgrounds who might speak a different language, that does help as well. And also tapping into some of these parts of the city that don't often get covered as much in the quote unquote mainstream media.
Now, as mentioned, the heart of the book are the characters you profile. I want to look at some of them, obviously not all of them, time constraints and all of that. But let's start off with Alfonso Benedetti, the eponymous Mr. Benny of Benny's Market in Strathcona. As you put it, Benny's is like a corner store from a Fred Herzog photograph come to life. How did you come across this story?
I think Benny's Market is an institution in Strathcona. It is on a very well-trafficked bike lane, so it's a perfect place for people to slow down and grab a sandwich from him, maybe sit on the patio. It's a beautiful brick building, and it is kind of an anomaly because it not only because of the fact that it's a shop in a residential neighborhood, but this is a shop that for many years became one of the last vestiges of an Italian presence in Chinatown. And that was an incredible interview. It's too bad that Mr. Benny Sr. He has passed away a couple of years ago. So I did this interview almost 10 years ago now. But when I listened again to that tape when I was writing this book, it just stood for me like everything I wanted this book to stand for, because he was so alive when I was listening to the tape again. This was a guy who remembered names of people's kids' faces. He remembered who lived on which block, what unfolded on that block. And I think now, we think of social media as being a very digital thing, but this was a guy who embodied like all of that. He had all of those connections and all of that memory. And I love the idea that there was a little village here. There was a little universe here. Everybody knew everybody. Everybody seemed to be in everybody's business. And those kinds of connections, those relationships and reciprocity was really incredible to me. And also some of the stories, like he was talking about, I think it was his father-in-law who was shot over a disagreement over money in Strathcona. And this wasn't like 100 years ago. In Vancouver's terms, that is quite long, but we are quite a young city, and it's at least within a couple generations, right? It's kind of wild to think that there is this, I guess, for those early settlers, there was a wild west type of mentality to living in this place, that it was a bit rough, it was a bit dangerous. And in particular, being in the East End, this was a place where it was diverse because people from different parts of Europe, and also the growing Chinatown as well, this was the place where they found a bit of a refuge where they could live outside of the Anglosphere of Vancouver life. And that's how a lot of these relationships in the old East End, which is now known as Strathcona, blossomed.
Now, also, the Mr. Benny story contains possibly my favorite line in the book, which is, "Eat your steak while you still got teeth."
Yes, and it was strange when I started to put these together. There were a lot of, I guess, what I would call like these old timers who started to say the same thing. So when I was doing the Duffins Donuts story, the guy who also has an incredible migration story, a refugee from Cambodia, worked in a hospital kitchen in Ottawa, went down to LA to learn the donut trade from his relatives, where a lot of other refugees were selling as well, to open Duffins Donuts, which is why they have the donut menu, but they have the torta menu and the pupusas as well, brought up from LA. But he said he didn't really stopped to eat donuts before, and now he can't eat them in his old age. So he's he says, if you have something sweet, like eat that while you can. And it's kind of an echo of that Benny story as well. So I think there is a lesson in there to pass down to us about carpe diem, if you like.
From donuts to baklava, we go, as another great story is the mystery of the baklava man. He's one of those great word of mouth figures in Vancouver, much like the opera man of Fairview, who you also mentioned. Everyone knows about, but they can't tell you what their actual name is. How did you come to know the baklava man?
Yeah, it's as you said, there's always one of these characters that's on the periphery of our lives, right? Especially if you are just going about your day in the neighborhood or waiting for the bus stop and you happen upon somebody like this. So I encountered him 3 times, always by a rapid transit stop. And this was around the time that Trudeau had Operation Syrian Refugees. And so I saw him, he had a sign that said Syrian family food. So reporters always have that spidey sense when they happen upon a story. There's like, okay, there's got to be something here. This is what's happening in the headlines, but this elderly gentleman, he must have a story. So eventually, I got chatting to him with lots of help from Google Translate, but he was a very friendly guy. He seemed really open, and as we got to chatting, he starts to mention, it's like, oh, I actually used to have a political career in Syria, and I looked him up, and it seemed like a lot of Syrian media had picked up on the fact that he was here, but nobody locally had made that connection quite yet. And as I was chatting with him, he would sell downtown. He would make his baklava at home, wheel it down in a cart. He knew that this was maybe under the table, so whenever he finished selling his stock, he disappeared. And so there started to be this, word of mouth, especially on Reddit lore, about this guy, calling him the baklava man. And I would try to meet him whenever he was setting up shop. And one day he just pulls out this photo on his phone and shows me, and it was him meeting George Bush at the White House. And so yeah, it just kind of blew my mind that, like, okay, well, had suspected there was a connection here with what was going on with this mass exodus, but I had never would have expected that he was somebody who had held office and was an independent candidate, which I had learned was quite rare at the time. So I think it just shows you, like, who are these, you're talking about the news, right? And how we might approach the story for like a daily hit. You could easily just do a cute story on this guy and be like, oh my God, like there's this connection. But I think there's another story here to ask about immigration, and also about, who are these people who happen to be street vending, doing this kind of survival vending. So he told me a lot of things about that. He refused to take welfare, which some people do because they do have a sense of pride and feel like they should earn it on their own. And also that this was one of the few things that he did know how to do, that kind of tangible trade. And of course, that is what a lot of people do when they are taking to the street and trying to run a business on their own. So I guess I felt very fortunate to have met him and had the time to spend on that story, and that eventually he did not get in trouble for doing this illegal vending.
Without giving too much away, is there a happy ending to the baklava man tale?
He eventually went back home. So with the fall of the Assad regime, he went back home to try and rebuild things over there.
Now, another great topic in the book is the Vancouver Special, the unloved but more recently celebrated architectural phenomena that is unique to the city. But here as well, you tend to look at it through a different lens, how it helped to welcome immigrants, integrate into Canadian society. How did it do that?
Yeah, so nowadays, as you said, there is a resurgence of interest in Vancouver Specials. This boxy house, stucco, 2 stories, and when I hear people talk about it now in the mainstream and media, they're like, "Oh wow, they're so spacious, lots of renovation potential." And I think now I can understand why. In Vancouver, we are cramped for space. So when there is a house that provides something like that, like, of course, we're going to gravitate towards it. But back then, this was very much a starter house. This was a house where the format was very flexible, not just for a nuclear family, but if you did have maybe grandparents coming in, they could look after the kids while mom and dad went off to work. Or if you have an uncle and aunt who happen to be landing in this country, they could have their own unit downstairs while still being together under the same roof. So the special really does have that this social history as well. And considering that there's 10,000 of these things just across Vancouver, you can imagine how many lives that this kind of a boring format was able to host, just because of how spacious it was, and because of what I really think is quite an intelligent design. And I love the origin story of it, because there wasn't really an origin story. There are different accounts of who might have invented the Vancouver special, but I love the idea that we don't really have a definite story, because this was the house that was designed by a builder, not so much a serious architect, at a time when people were looking for more real estate in Vancouver. So even then, people wanted to have more space. It was when houses began to expand their footprints, and agents knew that this was a house type that was going to be in demand as people were moving over here. And because it was a builder, this wasn't something that, I guess, the architectural elite of the time thought to record. There's a wonderful SFU thesis about this. So I like the idea that it is lost to time, because when it showed up on the scene, people didn't really care to think about that. But in think of how democratized the house is, I like that as well. I think it's in fitting of the fact that this is a house that really belongs to the people, and it is what people make of it. And even now, so many years later, it is still a house that is desired. So the family that I interviewed for the book, the Gurn family, they remembered all the details. There was a clear story, like the skylight thing on the top floor that would come down and hit their TV. The doors were carved in a certain way. The older versions of these houses, they did have really beautiful crown moldings done by Italian builders at the time. And remembering too, when they were upstairs watching a Canucks playoff game, I think it was the Oilers or something, who they were playing against at the time, and the family in the basement were cheering for the Oilers. So as they were cheering for the Canucks upstairs, they could hear the neighbors every time the Oilers scored in turn. So I do really love that there is a relationship between the different spaces of the house, even beyond having to share it with family, but sharing it with perhaps a tenant family too, as that mortgage helper.
The story is also a lot like your one about the Kingsgate Mall. Here again, something seemingly ordinary and mundane is made very compelling and interesting. What is it about Kingsgate Mall that we find fascinating in a perhaps ironic way now?
I think everybody who goes to Kingsgate Mall nowadays would be like, it's like, why is this here? Especially if they're coming out of maybe having their espresso in a nice third wave coffee shop, or if they live in a condo nearby. Because as Mount Pleasant is changing, this is a mall that occupies, this really major intersection right off of Kingsway and on Boundary. And because this is a mall that has been tangled in this weird real estate, not between the city and the real estate developer Beatty, who runs the mall. It just happens to be the site that has become resistant to development in that way, as they're trying to solve it. But for us, for everyday people who are going to the neighborhood, we get to enjoy the mall for a little bit longer. It's got this longer lease on life. You go in, it is very much a leftover from its era. It is a mall that feels like it might belong in small town BC. One of my favorite things about it is this Italian mural that's by the washrooms, that you look like you're looking across this Tuscan landscape, but it's done by probably just typical like acrylic paint, like while you're on your way to the loo. And I think it is, there are a lot of people who have made good use of the space. It is quirky. The Museum of Personal Failure was in there last year. I think there's another artist exhibit coming up this year as well. But I think one thing we forget is that there's, with all of those old apartments, those old walk-ups in the area, there are a lot of really long-time tenants who have hung in there, who have resisted eviction. They might be getting on in their years, and they have very affordable rents. And this is a neighborhood where there aren't very many places for you to just hang out, like other than the library. A lot of the coffee shops, a lot of the restaurants there are they are quite expensive. It's not like the working class Mount Pleasant of its day. So just to have a place to hang out, and just it is temperature control, like it is a mall. It is a rare refuge. It's too bad the Bilo is gone, because I felt like that was very much part of Kingsgate Mall. But as a what sociologists call this third space, it's not work, it's not home, it's a place where you can be with others. And this is a third space where you don't necessarily have to spend money. You can just go there. It's nice that we have Kingsgate for a little bit longer, and it's also nice to see how other people are bringing in new things to do in the mall as well.
Indeed. One of the strengths of the book, I should mention as well, is how you combine straight reporting with elements of memoir. For instance, you describe growing up in a blue house on the street that split Vancouver in two, Ontario Street. Now, just as an aside, I went basically a good chunk of my adult life not knowing that Ontario was the divide. I always thought it was Main
Maine.
Street
Yes.
because that would make more sense for some reason. But how did growing up in the borderlands, as you call them, come to color your view of the city?
I was growing up as a 90s kid, and I think in with the crowd that I had at school from both sides of this border, whenever adults talked about the East Side, there's like a kind of like, oh, okay, like you're from that neighborhood. But when you spoke about somebody who lived on the West Side or went to a particular school, the adults be like, oh wow, like as if you were on the up or something. And I think this was really emblematic in the media of the time, because we would talk about the $1 million line, and for a very long time in the Sun, they would talk about Ontario Street, the east-west border, being the line that divided what properties were worth. And as somebody who's a writer who thinks about like metaphor, I really liked that idea, because like, is this part of town really sketchy, or is it, why are we thinking of it as sketchy? Is it because a particular kind of person lives there and we feel a kind of stigma towards them, or is there something aspirational about the West Side as well? Parts of it being whiter, and part of the monster house social panic at the time too. So reading, putting this book together, I really had that theme firmly in my mind about like, okay, well, why was this place considered sketchy? And hopefully, as I said, I didn't want there to be those skylines and like beaches in here. I wanted to bring people in those neighborhoods where maybe we haven't really heard firsthand from somebody who had lived there before. So you, of course, you can read this book and just enjoy the stories, but I would think that if you do it cover to cover, you might start to think about those kinds of things as well.
Now, when we started talking just now, we talked about telling stories about people and places not typically covered by our mainstream media. What do you hope then that people get out of the book?
I hope that they would like I mentioned I love myths, like I love nonfiction writing, like I love magazine writing, all of that stuff. And I think I like it because there's a strong sense of empathy where you can put yourself into somebody else's shoes, like for a longer period of time, where the goal of that work maybe isn't to purely inform somebody like the news of the day, but so you could experience something, maybe learn a little bit something, like you might be entertained as well, like hanging out in somebody's garden like you do in my book, or learning how they first came to Vancouver with nothing more than an address on a piece of paper. So I would hope people do appreciate um, what what journalism can offer in that way. And I don't really have an answer for the second part of this, which is what's going to become of media in the future. But there are parts in between each story of this book where I do show up, and I think one of the most poignant episodes that I had the privilege of living through was the sad time when the Sun Province left 200 Granville, like right on the downtown waterfront. And whenever journalists, get that layoff announcement, I really liked that there was a camaraderie where everyone would rally together, put money together for booze, and then deliver it to the people who suffered the blow. And I had always wanted to go to that newsroom. It just had this sense of grandeur being, in a tower on the waterfront. And I knew that this was going to be my last chance to do it. So I put my hand up and I volunteered. I was like, I'll deliver the booze. I'll get to go. And so I took the elevator up. I remember seeing that a lot of people had cleared out already at that time, but the view was beautiful of the inlet, and it was a huge spread that they had on that floor, and you had this sense that okay, like something is definitely changing in terms of media and how we tell stories. And that was I think that was before COVID. And looking now, so much more has changed. Papers have slimmed down, much more layoffs. New media has come out. There is innovation, but who's going to be the ones like treading water? And also, people's relationship to information is different. They might be turning to social media. Meta has become really antagonistic towards news. So there's a lot. There's a lot that's going on. So I do wonder, like, what's going to happen to people who do this kind of chronicling? Maybe instead of me writing an 8,000-word story, it's going to be someone putting out an 80-second TikTok. I don't know. But maybe by reading this book, people will at least come to awareness of what is going on.
The name of the book is Very Vancouver, Uncovering the Soul of a West Coast City. It is published by ECW Press. My thanks to author Christopher Cheung.
Thank you so much, John.
Look for The Bookshelf wherever you find your podcasts. And as always, you can read more at johnackerman.substack.com.